Yes, so I just wanted to start off by saying a little bit about the philosophy of contemporary and future science project. So it's about changes in contemporary science and how they impact epistemic issues and introduce related challenges for future science. So we were just talking about it before the recording started. So the use of machine learning is one such case, which Florian's going to talk about today. One of the problems it introduces, he's going to talk about is precisely like, do we understand what's going on in some kind of black box? And that's a simple way of putting it, but of course there are lots of layers of complexity which Florian's going to go through in the way you can ask that question. Another one is the increase in interdisciplinarity. You can have a clash of epistemic cultures, and that you can even have them in a discipline. So, you know, what a simulator is doing, is there a hierarchy where the simulator is kind of at the beck and call of the person doing wet work or the pen and paper theoretician, those kind of questions. How does that affect what science puts out? What can we do to mitigate any problems that are introduced by these kind of hierarchies? So those are the kind of questions we're interested in. And one of the unique features of the project is that scientists are involved as well. So scientists and philosophers really coming together. We're going to arrange various activities, including the seminars, like the first seminar today. Thank you for coming. Workshops, conferences, edited outputs, and hopefully a useful website, a website that's actually got a repository of information, like, for example, not only old talks, but also maybe some lit reviews, right? So if you're interested in this topic, you're going to find some summaries of the papers there, so it should help the community as well. Not just somewhere that says we're doing this. And we already have a Twitter feed as well, which hopefully you could sign up to if you're interested in keeping abreast of what's going on, and just be, you know, little tweets coming out telling you what's coming up. And if you want to get involved with the project, by all means, please get in touch with me or Andre or William, the other two people working on the project. You can see, you can wave Andre and William if you guys. Okay, thanks very much. I will, with no further ado, pass on to Andre to introduce our speaker.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for coming. We are very grateful to have Florian Boge here, and he will talk to us about two dimensions of opacity and the deep learning predicament. And I think, Florian, we discussed going for about 45 minutes or so. And I can put a little reminder in the chat for you. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, so let me start sharing my screen then, I guess. Here we go. Let me actually you guys. I can see you better during the talk. Okay. Good. So, yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to Daryl, Andre, and William. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very excited to be actually the first speaker in this very interesting seminar series. So, my talk is going to be on what I call the two dimensions of opacity, so black boxness, as Daryl correctly said, of deep learning and the predicament that they, or one of them, creates, in my opinion. So maybe a little bit of background about me. I'm currently still involved in this very nice research unit called the epistemology of the Large Hadron Collider. So we have this big thing with a couple of particle physicists, philosophers, historians, and sociologists distributed across Europe and even in one instance in the US. That's soon going to come to an end. And I'm very happy to report that very soon my own project called DNN, Scientific Understanding in Deep Neural Networks, is going to start somewhere here in Germany, so keep an eye out for that. And the positions that are going to be advertised in the course of it. So let me now finally come to contents. Let me start off by reading from the popular science press, as it were. So here we read, for instance, in Nature magazine, that barely a day goes by without a promise that artificial intelligence will revolutionize yet another aspect of our lives. For instance, in research fields such as speech recognition or biological imaging, we see spectacular results. Maybe you've heard about this Google deep neural network called AlphaFold 2 that was able to very successfully predict protein structures only from amino acid sequences. So that was kind of a breakthrough. Furthermore, we read stuff like AI is changing the way we do science. And this, of course, is, I suppose, interesting for the project that you guys are involved in. What's also interesting here for me is that there's the mention of the hunt for new particles, which is a context that I'm a bit familiar now with, obviously. And so what I will do here is use that in part this case study to ask a bit about what's special about deep learning or deep neural networks in science, what makes them special, and why would they change the way we're doing science? So at least I want to give one answer to that question. Of course, there can be many further different answers to that open question. So here's a bit of an outline. So first, I want to go into the notion of deep learning models. What are they? Why are they called models? In what sense are they models? That's a question that I think needs to be addressed even more by philosophers. That's still not perfectly well analyzed. I will give my own first attempt at it. And then we'll go into the instrumentality, as it were, that I see associated with these models, and why it does connect somehow to, well, let's say, problems with generating understanding. I will then go into the main theme of the talk, the 2 dimensions of opacity, as I call them, and how they emphasize or amplify the problem. And then I will sketch what the problem actually is, what the predicament is, that we somehow gain something through the use of these specifically opaque models, but at the same time might be losing something. Right, so what are deep learning models? So deep learning overall is, you could say, the science of making deep neural networks learn. So what's a deep neural network? That's a term of art, I guess, in artificial intelligence. It's really like something that you can depict by this here. So you have like this arrangement of nodes connected by directed edges. And these nodes are organized into layers. So here you see the first layer. I don't know whether you can see my cursor. The first layer here, the yellow one, which is the input layer. So you feed in some data ordered into maybe a vector, or it could be a tensor. If it's an image, then it's a tensor, for instance, and transformed into numbers, obviously. And then these edges here, they transmit some amount of information from this input by weighting it somehow to these layers here that are called hidden layers. And the hidden layers then then execute activation functions, as they're called, so nonlinear functions on the input they receive. Then somehow you get to an output. So as I said, there are here these weights attached to the edges, and they're adjustable. And by adjusting these weights in response to further data instances, you can make this deep neural network learn. And so, for instance, it could learn to predict a certain class label or something, so that you know what type of data point you're seeing. So a quite obvious sense in which this could be a model is that it could be a model of the human brain, but maybe you can already guess this from this diagram. Of course, these would be very crude models of actual human brains or biological brains. There's some people trying to improve on that situation. They're trying to create networks that have spiking functions, so they imitate the spiking activity of actual biological neurons. But note also that, I mean, with some modest success, to be honest. But note also that if this was the intended sense of model, then of course the range of systems that we could model using these deep neural networks would be quite limited. It would only be some biological brains. There's another sense in which deep learning overall could be associated with modeling. Here Cameron Buckner has an interesting paper in Synthese, where he basically claims that we can gain some insight into cognitive processes in humans and animals by investigating how these neural networks learn. So the algorithm that corresponds to the learning in quotation marks and scare quotes could be informative. Maybe it could be some sort of model of actual biological learning. But again, we would face the same situation. We would have a very limited range of systems to model, namely learning biological systems. So here's a different perspective. Consider again this diagram here. It corresponds to essentially something of this form here. So you have X being the input, which I said is some sort of data vector transformed into numbers, so you can do computations. And then the first set of edges corresponds to a linear transformation of that input vector with 3 parameters. So you have a matrix of weights, and the weights are adjustable. You can add a bias term, as it's called, so another vector that's also 3 parameter or set of 3 parameters. And then you feed that into the next function here, which is then a set of nonlinear functions, such as sigmoidal functions or something that has a nonlinearity at 0 or something. And so you could really think of this as just being a concatenated function, really, of this data vector, which has a range of 3 parameters. And then you can update these parameters. There's a standard, well, there's a basic prescription that around which most of these learning procedures, as they're called, are built, which is called stochastic gradient descent. Basically, you update the parameters by moving along the gradient of a certain thing called a loss function, which determines how badly, on average, the neural network is performing at a certain value of these parameters on a testing data set, on a training data set. Then you just move a small step into a direction of fewer loss in the space of all these parameters. So the main thing about this is that in this way, you can approximate a huge number of different functions that could be of interest. So a huge number of input-output relations. Now, the output could be, as I said here, a set of classes. So you classify the data. It could be a continuous range of values, or well, approximate a continuous range of values so that you could model some sort of function that you're interested in here. It could also be like a data-like output so that you basically, for instance, process an image to get out some salient features. So but the main point is that in this way here, by concatenating linear and nonlinear contributions, you can in principle approximate many, many functions. And it's also been shown that you can do this with this basic prescription here for the learning, as it were, in finite times. So here's a different sense of model that I think is actually the right one if you want to think of deep learning as involving models in a more general sense. Here, Hasty and colleagues in their book on statistical learning say, using data, we build a prediction model, which will enable us to predict the outcome for new unseen objects. You find similar quotes in Paris and Gibson's book on deep learning. They say fundamentally, machine learning is using algorithms to extract information from raw data and represent it in some type of model. We use this model to infer things about data that we have not yet modeled. So the focus here is really on prediction in a certain sense, and in inferences about further data. You have like this model that you use to, when you train on certain data to perform well in a way that you know it should perform, and then you use it to analyze further data and say similar things about them. But of course, this already kind of creates a bit of an intuitive problem, maybe. Here's a review by two Google researchers. A review of methods in deep learning for scientific discovery. And they say here that many standard applications of deep learning focus on prediction, learning to output a specific value given an input. On the other hand, scientific applications are often focused, or maybe they should say should be focused, because that's a bit of a question, on understanding, identifying underlying mechanisms giving rise to patterns in the data. So of course, it's nice if we have something that gives us, that predicts to us how proteins are supposed to look like if they are constituted by certain amino acids, but we also would like to know how they manage to get into that shape, because that information could be interesting also for protein engineering, for instance, or understanding function better, and just be of scientific interest. It seems like that this is something we want to know. So this brings me to the question of instrumentality in understanding, because I think the way I've identified these deep learning models makes for a certain specific kind of instrumentality. So consider once more here this nice little diagram of what's called shallow neural networks. So then have one of these hidden layers. If you have multiple ones, they're called deep. And this corresponds to this mathematical, you could make it correspond to this mathematical function by choosing a certain activation function. So the point is that already with this very simple setup here, you can reproduce the outputs of the exclusive OR function. So this is a model that can learn, as it were, to output the values for the exclusive OR. But of course, you can also use it to model a number of different systems. So you could use it to, you could interpret the inputs as being propositions of the truth values of propositions, and then you map from pairs of these to another truth value. But it could also, you could also model a certain circuit with this, the activities in a certain circuit, of course, the XOR gate as it's called, or just a set of jointly exhaustive and mutually disjunctive events, such as the outcomes of a coin flip. So what this is a model of is really dependent on how we conceptualize, as it were, the inputs, and in relation to that, the outputs of the neural network. So of course, this is not completely different from what has been done with models in the past. Of course, it depends. So models can be used to model very different. Mathematical descriptions of models can be used to stand in for very different things. But I think that the way in which we interpret these models to represent something about the system is very different. So in a classical model, such as, say, a model of the harmonic oscillator, we do associate meanings to all the mathematical terms. We interpret the x as the oscillation of something. We interpret here the gamma as the damping of that oscillation. We interpret the omega as the period of the oscillation, and so forth. And the derivatives are, of course, like a small distance in time, or in the changes in the variable. And so depending on what system we want to model as a harmonic oscillator, we immediately know something about its behavior by looking at the equations. So for instance, if we want to model the concentration of a certain chemical or something as a harmonic oscillator, a damped harmonic oscillator, the x at 0 could be like a baseline concentration, and we see like from an initial concentration, it oscillates around that baseline and then approximated in the long run. So not so much in deep learning. I mean, you basically just interpret the output as saying something about the system of interest, as classifying in a certain way or putting out salient structures in the data you've gathered about it. And of course, you conceptualize the data as being somehow representative of something to do with that system. But the weights, the biases, the activations functions, etc., for the purpose of using that in science are not being interpreted in the ways we used to do that with more traditional models. So I would say this makes for a certain kind of instrumentality, but maybe not one that comes to mind immediately. So here's, for instance, a quote by Basso and colleagues from, I think, the Springer handbook on the philosophy of modeling. Here say, according to an instrumentalist interpretation, if a model yields accurate predictions, then the truth or falsity of its assumptions doesn't matter. So a model could be instrumental while being deliberately unrealistic. We could say it's okay to make unrealistic assumptions which we immediately think are not necessarily correct, but are useful for a certain purpose. Call that R instrumental. This is the traditional sense in which we have thought about instrumentality, maybe in philosophy. I think in contrast to this, deep learning models are instrumental while being devoid of content. They don't even specify many things about the system you're analyzing. They only specify, well, one property, which is basically the output, and another property or set of properties, which is basically the input. So you may ask, so what's the connection and difference, since you also said you want to go into simulation practices, what's the connection difference, or what are connections and differences to other computational models? So when you implement these models on a computer, you let the computer do the learning. So the natural standard for comparison might be computer simulations, which are also computational models that we have used to predict something about data in the past. And I think the most salient difference is that computer simulations begin with a conceptualization of a targeted system. So in an effort of shameless self-production, I here point to a paper of my own, where I have an analysis of the kinds of models that go into a simulation process and that then let you infer something about the targeted system. The most important point is, and this is of course not my own invention, you find very similar analyses in the works of Margaret Morrison or Eric Winsberg, that the first step that you do is conceptualize your targeted system in a certain way. You apply some continuous mathematics, for instance, to conceptualize your target system in a certain way, but then maybe the equations could be intractable, for instance. Then you discretize the model, you write a computer code that's supposed to capture this discretized model, and so forth. And then then the computer run that to gather information about the system. I think this really contrasts with deep learning, because here you just begin with a conceptualization of certain data that you have about the system, not with conceptualizing the system itself in any more informative way. So you might think that this is a bit of an oversimplification, and of course I agree. Many computer simulations are more complex than just a simple hierarchy here. We have with physicist Christian Seidnitz, we have another paper in Synthese where we analyze some of the complexities of simulations as they're used, for instance, at the LHC. But we do also identify substructures in the modeling process that do obey this basic linear ordering. So it's a bit of a simplification, but it's not entirely wrong. I think the point holds up to scrutiny. Okay, so computer simulations are different. Let's assume that's correct. Maybe deep learning is basically just a form of statistical modeling. And in a way that I think this is correct. I think you've all seen this famous internet meme where you have like statistics being just a crack in the wall, and somebody frames it in a certain way, you can call it machine learning. And then when you present it to an audience, you of course have to call it artificial intelligence. I think there's something to that, but still there are certain differences between deep learning and traditional statistical modeling, at least. So traditional statistical models could be thought of as families of probability distributions, which are ordered by a certain set of parameters as well. So of course you immediately see the similarity. You have like this parameterized model that you somehow adapt to a certain data set. But first of all, the choice of models is here initially based on the shape of the data, as some statisticians point out. So you get an intuition for what the data look like. You build up a histogram or something. Then you guess what a good probability model for that distribution would be. Furthermore, some people in the Nature Methods paper on statistics versus machine learning point out is that statistical methods have a long-standing focus on inference, where inference is not to be construed solely about further data points, but typically inference to something more interesting, maybe, which is achieved through the creation and fitting of a project-specific probability model. By contrast, deep learning concentrates on prediction using general purpose learning algorithms to find patterns in often rich and unwieldy data. So the salient differences here, I would say, is that for statistical modeling, you have to have traditional statistical modeling, you have to have a fair amount of insight into the structure of the data already to find the correct model. Whereas, and then you want to usually connect that up with further, well, you could have already a more interesting scientific model or theory in mind that is connected to your probability distribution, and you can draw inferences about that. But most importantly, it's always project specific. You have like this one data set that you want to analyze using statistics, and then you want to draw inferences from that. Or maybe you have a couple of data sets, but still restricted range. And in deep learning, you have this very general, as I said, model that can approximate a broad range of input-output connections. And then only by training that on the data, you find these patterns afterwards. So why would all that make any connection to understanding? There might be different forms of understanding, or there probably are various forms of understanding. So some people defend that you have this objectual understanding, which is not necessarily tied to explanations. I think you could read Catherine Elgin in this way, and Brenda Delson definitely defends this view. And I think it's also, it might be correct, but I will here be focused on understanding that is somehow generated through explanation. As you know, maybe some people like Harry Khalifa defend that all understanding is promoted by explanation. But I think it's clear that at least some understanding is generated by explanation, or a lot of understanding is mediated by explanations. So here are some quotes from famous works on explanation and models. So Margaret Morrison, in the famous Models as Mediators volume, says that the reason that models are explanatory is that in representing their target systems, they exhibit certain kinds of structural dependencies. Furthermore, Morgan and Morrison together say that the process of interpreting, conceptualizing, and integrating that goes on during model building is somehow connected to being able to learn about the system in a sense that can generate understanding. And here's somebody rather on a rather different set of views. Henk de Recht, in his recent monograph, says that a model-based explanation of a phenomenon is obtained by constructing a specific model that represents the target system in such a way that theoretical principles can be applied to it. Which then, yeah, okay, good, no question. Which then provide the conceptual tools for achieving understanding. So two things are noteworthy here. Everybody says that somehow if you want to generate explanations, you need to represent your target system. And as I told you before, I think this is only true in a very limited sense in deep learning or deep learning models. And furthermore, of course, you have to be able to use that representation to, or they have to be, the representation has to be based on certain concepts you entertain about the system in question. And that, of course, connects quite strongly to our ability to generate understanding. So here, let me give you an example to see the contrast a bit more clearly. There's this famous model by Schelling, which he used to reproduce, let's say, in segregation patterns that you see in, for instance, US American cities. So this very, very simple setup, like a checkerboard arrangement where you just filled vacant spaces with randomly in the first place with black and white figures, or here's hashtag and white dots, representing, for instance, black and white inhabitants in a certain neighborhood. So the fun thing was that Schelling could show that with a very modest preference for equally colored neighbors or same type neighbors, and some very simple moving rules, such as move to the nearest vacant space, which satisfies your preferences, he could reproduce the patterns that we know from certain US American cities, where you have like these segregated neighborhoods, where some are purely black neighborhoods, and more or less purely black neighborhoods, and some are purely white neighborhoods, as it were. So it's not necessarily, it's not so perfectly clear whether this is the mechanism that does produce these patterns, but at least there's some evidence, or some people quote some evidence that points in the direction that something like the Schelling type mechanism might be going on. But the main thing is that it immediately gives us some amount of understanding about how segregation could come about. At the very least, it gives us how possibly understanding. How is it possible that segregation comes about? Do we have to assume institutional racism or something like that? We don't. It could be produced by very different mechanisms. So there's even though this is a very simple and deprived kind of model, it does conceptualize the target in such a way that it does promote understanding quite immediately in medicine. Now, I would say this is really quite a bit different in deep learning applications, or maybe machine learning applications more generally. So here in high energy physics, some people have use deep learning in benchmark studies on how to discover new particles that people have so far not seen in actual data. So they use simulated data where they know what the hypothesis in question would be that corresponds to these data. And so one quantity that is quite extremely helpful in finding evidence for new particles is the likelihood ratio. So you can show that in a certain sense it's a statistically optimal quantity, optimal test statistic. The ratio between the likelihood of observing the data on account of the null hypothesis that there is no effect versus on the account of the hypothesis that there is an effect. So the problem is that the theory is often intractable, and you cannot get these quantities from directly from the physics, the underlying physics. You could try and approximate these quantities both, or the ratio between them, by means of simulations, but that takes like huge amounts of time and computing time. And so here, Boge and colleagues have suggested that you could use a classifier that sorts data points into a background and signal, as it were, in order to replace basically this activity of approximating the likelihood ratio. So of course, in order to be able to do that, you have to conceptualize the data in a certain way. You have to apply certain cuts to check whether it's possible, whether this is really signal or background data. And you have to train the model to recognize signal and background data. So you have to put in some amount of your own concepts and ideas about what the data represent, but only at the stage of defining the data. And then, of course, in the end, it looks like the relation established between these data and the outputs of the neural network can somehow approximate the likelihood ratio. It can give you the same estimate as to how many background and how many signal events were there, and whether there's really an excess of events that would qualify as signal. So I would say when you use these deep learning methods here in science, it's possible, of course, to generate understanding, but it's much more indirect. And there's, I think, 3 crucial steps that you need to go through in order to get there. So the first, as I just told you, is the conceptualization of the input. You have to, of course, think about the data in a certain way. You have to format them in a certain way so that you can see how it's informative about the system in question. Then you train the deep learning model to give a certain output, and then after that, you can say, okay, it now represents relation X by Z, such as, for instance, the likelihood ratio. But then comes the crucial step, and then you have to go back and connect that represented something to, well, I here say underlying mechanisms, but maybe more generally, you can say understanding, promoting scientific models. And this third step, I think, has also been recognized by Emily Sullivan in the BJPS paper, where she calls this the problem that she sees here, link uncertainty. It's not always clear how to link a deep learning model back to further scientific evidence and models. I would say it could also sometimes make for an actual link absence. And this is what I will basically suggest in the end. So here's an illustration of the process that I have in mind. So you so for instance, in particle physics, you could perform machine learning on the level of raw data, as it were. So you can just collect, like here, dots of activity in a detector. You interpret this, of course, to represent the energy deposits that a certain particle left in the detector at a certain time. Then you subject that to some sort of deep learning algorithm, and then you get like probabilistic information about the distribution of these tracks here. So, but then of course you will have to evaluate that information that you get from the deep learning neural network and connect it back to some sort of, say, Lagrangian that would give you a scattering cross-section that corresponds to, or that gives you the right scattering cross-sections that would give you these distributions. So I would say it's really a 3-step process, and the crucial point is here, this final step where you go back and say, okay, and this relation that the DNN has established is connected to process XYZ on account of models ABC. Okay, so much for instrumentality. As I said, I think they have a kind of instrumental character, but you could bypass that if you have enough scientific knowledge in a certain domain, and then just connect it up to plausible mechanisms that give you back the same distribution or the same probabilistic information, whatever. I now come to the opacity bit, and I think this is really where it gets really interesting here. So what's opacity? I start with a similar definition by Paul Humphreys, which I think is still quite good. Sadly, we all know that Paul Humphreys passed away recently. But so many people quote this similar definition, and I think it captures many interesting features that I want to build around as well. So Humphreys tells us that a process, and he also has in mind simulations here, I think, is epistemically opaque relative to a cognitive agent X at a time t, just in case X does not know at t all of the epistemically relevant elements of the process. So there's 4 crucial elements here. You have a process, you have an agent, the agent doesn't know something, and that something is somehow relevant for the agent for generating further knowledge or maybe understanding. I think the novelty, or maybe at least in some sense the novelty of deep learning, is that it has 2 dimensions of opacity that have so far not been recognized elsewhere. We can discuss whether they exist elsewhere, but at least have not been recognized in the traditional debate. And I now want to introduce them and then tell you why I think there are 2 dimensions really of the same process. So note that the process in question in both of these sorts of opacity, let's say, is the same, namely the learning process. It's the process where the DNN learns to perform successfully on a training set, and then can be tested to perform successfully on a testing set. And there's one aspect that we don't understand about that really well. We do understand the basic mathematical ideas that it's supposed to work somehow, but there's many things that are not understood. For instance, why you have to have multiple layers to succeed faster. That's not really well understood. Why more parameters are better. We think that then it starts to overfit to a certain data set. That's not true. You can increase the amount of parameters and it gets better and better after a certain threshold. So many things are really not well understood here. And here in a paper by Schwartz, and Tishby, they say we want theoretical understanding of the learning. We want also theoretical understanding of the inner organization and as it changes as a function of this learning process. So call that H opacity for how opacity. It's opaque how these deep neural networks learn to predict successfully the next data point, the label for the next data point, or salient structures in the next data point. But there's a second aspect to this, which was emphasized in a physics paper by Chung, Cohn, and Osti, where they ask, what is the machine learning? Yeah? We also want to know what the information somehow contained in the data is that is being utilized by these algorithms to perform so successfully. So it's also not so clear what it is that they're picking up on. You have like this huge data set, you use just data points, and somehow there's structure in that that's informative in such a way that, for instance, the deep neural network can learn to predict the shape of proteins, which we can't. So call that W opacity for what opacity. It's also opaque in the learning what it is in the data that drives the process in such a way that the DNN performs successfully. So why would I think that these are 2 dimensions? So first of all, I said it's the same process, so it's 2 aspects of the same process. And I would say it's justified to call it dimensions if they're sufficiently independent of one another. Now, in the vector space, we call linearly independent, the number of linearly independent vectors that you can have, the dimension of the vector space. And similarly here, so the features of opacity that are somewhere independent from one another, I would call 2 dimensions or dimensions of opacity to the process. In the paper, I propose a criterion for checking whether they're independent in a certain sense. And I here say that 2 features of opacity to some process shall be considered independent dimensions in case they can be addressed by means of disjoint sets of variables. So that sounds quite abstract, but I will show you in a minute what that means. Maybe let us first consider the overall picture that I'm trying to draw here in a bit more detail. So this is a bit metaphorical, of course. I don't propose a genuine theory, a mathematical theory of opacity. But you could, when you really think of these H and W as 2 independent dimensions, you could think that they span like this quarter plane of positive values. So you could be independently H opaque or W opaque, a certain process. But then the overall opacity of this process, which is the learning of a deep neural network, is a function of both these opacities, as it were. And you could imagine it like this non-decreasing function here. But one important thing to note is that interpretability methods, which you try to render more transparent what's going on during the learning, don't have to reduce only one or the other. They could reduce both at the same time. So here it's like the path traced out by a certain interpretability method, and it reduces a fair amount in this image of H opacity, but not so much of the what opacity. It makes it more transparent how the thing learns, but not so much what it learns. Yeah, but as I said, I think there's some studies that basically just reduce H or W respectively. This is why I would think it makes sense to call them 2 independent dimensions of opacity, 2 independent features of opacity. So the first one I want to go into is the study by Schwartz, and Tishby that I mentioned before, which I found extremely interesting. Sadly, it turned out not to be perfectly general. It doesn't apply to, the findings don't apply to all possible DNN architectures, as it were. So depending on the kind of activation function you use, you see or do not see these processes. I should note here also that it has been also found interesting by other philosophers. Tim Raetz from Bern University has a very interesting philosophy of science paper on that same study. So one thing that Schwartz, Ziff, and Tishby found was that when you plot the mutual information, so this is this probabilistic concept, which could also be called the Kovac-Leiber divergence between the joint and individual distributions, it gives you probabilistic information about how much more you know on account of the joint distribution, so to speak, between two variables. So when you use these quantities for the input to a certain neural network and the hidden layer, or respectively the desired output, the thing that it's supposed to put out, and the hidden layers, then you can show that the hidden layers and the plane spanned by these two quantities have a certain dynamics, as it were. The thing that Schwartz and Tishby observed was that they first start maximizing, they crawl up on the information line, as it were, for the desired output. They start to learn how to predict the correct label, obviously. They start to maximize the information on what it is they're supposed to put out. That's expected. But then the interesting thing was that they could observe that they are starting to remove information on the input. So basically, they're starting to forget the information, as it were, that's irrelevant to performing correctly at the task. So this is quite impressive. Looks like we have like a sort of further deeper understanding of what's going on in deep learning. As I said, it's not perfectly general, sadly. But for my purposes here, another thing to know is important, namely that why the desired output, as I said here, is just a kind of dummy output. This wasn't an interesting scientific task that they put the subject of the neural network to. It was just some dots distributed across the sphere, and then the thing was supposed to decide whether the pattern satisfies a certain description or not. So as I said, the input itself is also just a dummy input. It was chosen because it satisfied certain equivalence conditions, so you could transfer the findings to several tasks. It didn't matter what the pattern to be recognized was or what the data were in the study. What did matter was A, the hidden layers themselves, and B, of course, the quantity characterizing, so to speak, their dynamics. Good. So much for the first interesting study. Here's the second one, which did something quite different, but still is a kind of trying to render more transparent what's going on during deep learning. So it takes me a bit of effort to explain this, so try to bear with me. This is a study also from particle physics, and they here did something similar to what Pierre Boge and colleagues have done. They used the simulation to model a hypothetical physics model and predict what the data would look like, or produce artificial data basically on account of that simulation. So this is a Z prime. This is a particle that has been quite clearly ruled out in the past. But of course, you can run a simulation looking what the data would look like if it existed. And they considered two versions of that Z prime. So the Z prime decays into electrons and positrons. And they have here one version where it decays symmetric, so coupled symmetrically to them. So you would expect the angular distribution of them to be the same. And one where it couples asymmetrically, so you would to expect the distribution to be different. You can see that here in these histograms here, the rapidity of the electron, which looks quite different from the rapidity of the positron. So the angular distribution of the two would be different in the red case, which is the asymmetric coupling case. So these quantities that you see here are physics-inspired quantities. They're called higher-level variables by physicists because you have to infer them from the data by a more involved process of using physical information. For instance, the M here is the reconstructed invariant mass, which basically gives you information about what mass the particle in question would have had to have if it had decayed into measurable products that you can see in the detector. So you have to infer this as a nonlinear function of the momenta that you measure in the detector, using also the relativistic energy momentum relation and the conservation of momentum and energy. So quite some amount of physics information goes into defining this variable as representative of the data. But you also can see here that it's a quite informative quantity because you can see the nice, so you can distinguish here, this is background data as it were, so photons also decay to electrons and positrons, so you expect them to contribute this amount of data here. And then you here have the signal data, which then gives this nice little bump on top of the background distribution. And this is how physicists usually discover new particles. Look, there's a bump there. Let's check whether it's genuine or just a fluctuation. So the fun thing was that they did not give this information to the deep neural network, neither this information nor the information on the differences in rapidities here. And then they defined a very clever, ingenious procedure to check whether it somehow did filter out that information by itself. They did what they called data planing, which is basically weighting these histograms by 1 over their height for the respective quantity. So you can see here what that does to the mass histogram. If you plane for the mass, as it were, you just get it back a uniform distribution in this lower panel here, obviously. If you unweight, so to speak, every point by the inverse of its height, you just get a uniform distribution. You can see here that also subtle changes in other distributions occur when you plane for the mass. And so there are overall, of course, changes in the data when you change each data point. But these data, so these changes are not as obvious and informative, of course. And what they did with this was try and see whether DNN that was very successfully able to predict or to distinguish signal from background data was still able to perform well if you remove this information here on these higher level physics quantities. So in the symmetric coupling case, it was sufficient to plane away the mass information, and then you could show that the neural network here failed basically in successfully distinguishing signal from background. It performed no better than guessing, well, this could be signal, this could be background. In the asymmetric coupling case, some discrimination power, and this is here the penultimate row here, remained when they only planed away this mass information, but when they then also removed the information about the difference in these rapidities here, the same thing happened. It was basically doing not much better than guesswork. So this gives you some information that apparently these neural networks are able to pick up on really interesting information contained in the data, such as higher level physics variables that particle physicists as well use to discern whether there's a particle and what it does, what kind of particle it is. But for the purpose of justifying talk of two dimensions, note that these rapidity differences and masses, they characterize the physics process. They don't characterize the network itself. Same thing for this performance measure here. It characterizes the overall performance of a task, which could be the performance of any old algorithm, and nothing to do with the inner workings of the deep neural network. So this justifies talk of two independent dimensions. There's really two independent things going on here. We don't know how they learn, and we don't know what they learn. Both of these are independent aspects of the capacity of these two deep neural networks. Why is this interesting? Well, because H opacity, as I call it, is very similar, or is maybe an instance of the more general opacity that we're familiar with. If you have like this complex simulation, you have like this huge model, somehow it gives you outputs and somehow you can validate that it works well, but you don't really know what's really going in inside. And I think this H opacity is very similar to that, if not an instance of that traditional sense of opacity that we as philosophers are aware of. I'm not so sure that W opacity has any parallel. We can discuss a bit about that maybe in the discussion. So it looks like there's something new here. I would definitely say the way in which this W opacity enters is quite new. That these DNNs are able to pick up on information we would like to have, but don't tell us what that information is. That's quite something new. So here comes now finally the predicament. Remember the 3 steps to understanding that I've outlined above. So you start by conceptualizing the input in a certain way. You then try to establish what a trained deep learning model represents on account of that. You check what relation instantiate, the y-x relation. But then you have to connect that back to something that would give you more information about maybe underlying mechanisms, or that would somehow promote understanding, some more understanding promoting scientific models. So now let me make some distinctions to explain to you why I think we could be witnessing a breach here when it comes to step 3 in the not so far future. So first of all, there's different ways of making these networks learn. One way would be supervised. The further ones, but I will focus here on these two. One way would be called supervised learning, the other one unsupervised learning. And in supervised learning, you have labeled data. So you already have a targeted label that the network is supposed to put out. And then you evaluate the performance by checking how closely it matches these labels on average. So for instance, you have like you have these data which are correspond to your signal hypothesis. There is a new particle. But you have these data which correspond to your background hypothesis. There's no new particle. And you label them beforehand, and then you check whether it did say signal or background. So you can do regression tasks, you can approximate functions in this way, you can do classification tasks. As I said, you can just classify data, which is maybe the discrete version of regression, as it were. But you can do something else. You can also evaluate the overall performance in relation to more general properties of the data set. And this would be called unsupervised learning, where you don't have labeled data. For instance, you could check whether your DNN is able to reproduce the known distribution of data, or whether it's able to reproduce some known structures that are in the data. And there you don't have target labels, and of course there's more freedom here in exploring different systems. And of course, if that works out, if you have unsupervised learning, it promises the greater discovery potential because you don't force the DNN to do this very narrow kind of task where you already say, oh, this is the correct label, this is the wrong label. Good. So furthermore, consider the following distinction between research contexts. So of course, traditionally, to some extent, we are bound to having hypotheses as to what we want to find by taking data. So you have this more traditional hypothesis-driven research, which I think is typical of particle physics still. But particle physicists, of course, have not discovered any new particles at the Large Hadron Collider. As you may know, they've discovered the Higgs, which was expected on account of the so-called standard model of particle physics. And now the idea is that because all the extensions of the standard model that particle physicists have liked have not worked out well, and because they have no idea how to include, for instance, gravity or dark matter into models in appropriate ways, you have to explore the data to get new ideas as to what might be there. So this is emphasized also in the European strategy paper for particle physics, that they are now going to enter an exploratory phase where they just explore new energies and massive amounts of data. But another thing to note is that, of course, here Friedrich Steiner, who has written basically the book on exploratory experimentation, that of course, the typical context for exploratory experimentation is the formation of new conceptual frameworks. If you already know what concepts to apply to data, then, well, you might find the right hypotheses to work from. But if you don't have any ideas, of course, you will typically have to find new concepts to think about what you might find in the data. Friedrich here uses the example of Faraday and the lines of force, the concept of lines of force. And he goes through the whole story, how he came up with the concept and how long it took him. And then, of course, that was used by Maxwell to devise the kind of electrodynamics we still learn today. And that, again, took quite an effort and quite a long time to get there. So it's not that easy to get from exploration of data, exploration of experimental research to the formation of new concepts. And I think a case in point is my favorite theory, quantum mechanics. So as you may or may not know, this was found as a theory, so to speak, by a couple of physicists working together. One major contribution was, of course, by Werner Heisenberg, who had a very first version of parts of what we now call modern day quantum mechanics. There's a nice thing by physicist Leonard Susskind, who says nobody has ever understood what the hell Heisenberg was smoking when he invented matrix mechanics. So this is a quite novel kind of theory that still puzzles us as philosophers, and well, physicists have just adapted themselves to working with it and don't care anymore oftentimes. But from a philosophical point of view, this is quite a novel and astonishing theory, because it looks like you have like things doing several things at the same time, or you have correlations that you cannot really causally explain or are difficult to explain causally, and so on. But to get to the concepts underlying this was quite a difficult process, obviously. The story goes that Heisenberg had a bad cough and went to Helgoland and then was studying Goethe the whole night and walking the hills. And then it dawned on him that this was the right way to conceptualize what's going on in the atomic realm. Maybe a bit of a hero story, but you get the gist. It was really, it took some strikes of genius, I would say, to get there. So now what happens if we face a similar situation, if we explore further data, but are bound to deep learning methods? So I would say that we can somehow get a huge problem in getting to this third step of connecting whatever the DNN finds in the data up to further more understanding promoting scientific models, if a constellation of conditions is met. So you have an exploratory experimental context, as is going to be the case in high energy physics, for instance. Then you have an unsupervised model, which is not so closely tied to what you already know, and therefore might discover something quite more radically new. And it makes an unexpected discovery, which requires a radical conceptual shift of us, as did maybe quantum theory back then in the day. So this basically brings me to the end. This is the predicament I see. You have this huge discovery potential. You know that there's this technology which picks up on very interesting properties contained somehow in data, but it might not tell you about that. And this can create like a situation where what we usually value in science, namely understanding, can get lost, despite the fact that we have new discovery potentials. So to conclude, deep learning models are special, at least in that they are, well, C instrumental, like maybe statistical or data models. but they're far more general and they're automatically generated or adapted to data. They're age opaque, like computer simulations. It's not so clear how they manage to predict successfully, how their inner workings are. But they're also, on top of that, doubly opaque. It's not clear what information they pick up on to succeed. And I think this is in some ways at least unlike any other one. So this may ultimately have a huge impact on science, may change science in certain ways, because it takes discovery out of researchers' hand to a certain extent, while leaving them maybe sometimes without understanding. And these are my references, and with that I am finished. Thank you very much.